Hello, and welcome to LGBTQ plus literature and queer mental health. My name is Sakshi Kumar, and I am the adult programs coordinator at Writers and Books. I am an Asian American woman with short black hair and brown skin, and I am wearing a white t-shirt and a light blue jean jacket. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Writers and Books would like to call attention to the complex and troubled history of the lands on which we live and work. We are hosting this, or we're recording this panel from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as the Seneca people, or the Keeper of the Western Door. As I mentioned, this is LGBTQ plus literature and queer mental health. These writers will shine a light on LGBTQ plus literature and discuss the indispensable work that this writing does in terms of visibility, creating safe spaces, and centering and honoring queer experiences. Our panelists are Kay Ulanday Barrett, Tembi Denton-Hurst, and Isle McElroy. And our moderator is Sarah Cipher. Our panelists and our moderators' books will be available through Writers and Books' indie bookstore, Ampersand Books. I encourage you to read their full bios on our website, wab.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sakshi, and we're really grateful to be a part of this conference, Writers and Books. And I'm honored to show up here alongside my peers. So welcome to our panel on LGBTQ plus literature and queer mental health. We're going to talk about a lot of things. We'll start by hearing excerpts of each of our work, just because I think that's a great way to get to know us. I'm Sarah Cipher. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm paneling in from the unceded Comanche lands around Austin, Texas. I'm a light-skinned Arab American woman wearing a pink and white striped shirt in front of a wall of books. And as you can tell from the books, I'm very passionate about this topic. I was a kid who didn't have a lot of queer role models growing up in a rural Arab American community in the 80s. So I came to the fullness of my identity somewhat late. But I did turn to books as mentors. And it's something I discuss often with my sister, who's a librarian. The books and the words available to us throughout our lives can literally mean life or death to a person. And that space is a survival space for me. And I think it feels especially important to be recognized and cared for in that sacred privacy of reading. And I found through books how those stories and voices can open up avenues of being, community, conviction, and freedom for a reader and as an eventual writer who's found community or a lot of different communities that have supported me throughout my journey. And I think I feel safe in saying I share that experience with many of you as well. So who better to discuss these issues and more than my fellow writers here in the Zoom room today? I would like to invite us to start with short readings of our work. I'll will start with you and then go to Kay and Tembi, and then I'll read very briefly as well, and then we can get into questions. So just a quick reminder, if you want to say your name for the folks joining us today, and perhaps where you're calling in from, a brief physical description and the pronouns that you'd like to use, that'll help us too. So thank you, and I look forward to chatting with you for the next hour and 10 minutes or so.
Thank you so much. I am Isle McElroy. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am a white American non-binary person. I'm based in Flatbush in Brooklyn, New York. I have long brown hair, wearing some purple earrings and a black shirt dress. So I'm going to read a little bit from my second book, People Collide, which is a story about a husband and wife who trade bodies. And I'm going to be reading a scene where the narrator, whose name is Eli, is going out for the first time in his, like, as his wife. Okay. In the dress, I understood why she wore it. I felt sexy and desired even before leaving the studio. I rarely felt this way in my own body, even on the occasions when Elizabeth told me she loved my physique. No compliment ever seemed real to me, especially from the people who loved me, people who, I believed, were obligated out of love to compliment me and thus had every reason to lie. Our loved ones love us too much to tell us the truth. Wearing Elizabeth's dress, though, I sensed how it felt to be wanted. I wanted her, and I understood the desire that sometimes came up in sitcoms where this thing happened for men to ogle themselves. I entered the sliver of the bathroom to take a stab at putting on makeup. Elizabeth owned a very few products: mascara, 2 tubes of lipstick, an organic liquid foundation, a shade paler than her cheeks. I pumped the foundation onto 2 fingers and dragged it over my cheeks, rubbing it in like suntan lotion. But all of the skin untouched by foundation glowed with discoloration. I wiped it off and searched for a tutorial on my phone. It took me a few tries to find an appropriate video. Most of them proposed complicated designs best suited for nights at a club, wide pink washes of eyeshadow and wings that Elizabeth never applied. Worse, the women applying their makeup worked quickly and assumed a basic level of mastery far beyond mine. I finally discovered a video called Easy Everyday Makeup Tutorial with a Bit of Glam by an artist named Aman. The video opened with a still shot of her face fully made up, the title hovering over her features before eerily shifting to video like a statue that had awoken. She welcomed me with a generic, "Hi guys," and suggested reading the description below to see the products she used in the video. I opened the description. There were nearly 24 products, a terrifying number compared with the amount that Elizabeth owned. After the introduction, Aman's face starkly reverted to its pre-makeup form, her black hair stringing wetly down to her neck. She lacked the chipper demeanor of the other artists I'd watched and moved swiftly, almost severely, through the routine. As I waited for her to apply one of the products that Elizabeth owned, I became aware of Aman's consistencies, the redness at the edge of her nostrils, which she concealed on her face, and the sleeplessness hinted under her eyes, soon also concealed. She pumped 2 squirts of Sheen foundation into her palm and buffed it into her skin using a 42 skunk brush, a name I was sure I'd misheard until I checked the description. Elizabeth did not own a skunk brush. I buffed the foundation using 2 fingers, making polite swirls where Aman advised. She moved on to powder, which she used to set the foundation. Elizabeth didn't own any powder, or bronzer, or blush, or eye primer, or brushes number 12, 22, 6, and 15. She did, however, have eyeshadow, only one color, not the 4 shades that Iman applied. And though I didn't have primer, I brushed the gentle golden color over my lids, dusting it on with a move that felt reckless. I shakily ran a brown eye pencil along the upper edge of my eye. Iman and I rolled mascara up our lashes. Like a mom, I did not have time to attach falsies. We moved to the lip. Elizabeth owned 2 colors. Mom went the nude, so I went the lighter of Elizabeth's options, a rosy color called Fairest in the Land. It was chunky from underuse. Aman used a similar color, but a brand of higher quality. Its case like a large golden bullet, which, when applied, made her lips appear pristine and pillowy. At the end of the video, Aman advised me to subscribe, and, grateful, I liked and subscribed. Sure, I'd watch another one of her videos soon. The sight of Elizabeth startled me, not because I'd done a poor job applying her makeup. For a first try, I'd done pretty well. She looked lovely, and I had, with a mom's assistance, highlighted her eyes and concealed her exhaustion. But the person looking back at me wasn't the woman I knew. I had created some other Elizabeth, not a person she had been hiding from me, but a person who didn't exist. She normally wore her hair in a messy bun, but every time I tried to put it up, strands would whisper down in front of my eyes, creating a maddening curtain. After a handful of failures, I tugged out the hair tie, content with wearing it down. Anyone who saw me would have taken me for Elizabeth testing out a new look. But in the mirror, all I saw were the differences between my Elizabeth and hers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Isle. That was one of my favorite passages of the novel, and I'm so glad that you read it. Kay, would you like to read from your poetry?
Hi, thank you. That was so beautiful, Isle. My name is Ulanday Barrett. Pronouns are he, they, and she. I am located in Rahway, New Jersey, on the unceded and occupied land of the Lenape and Munsee peoples. For accessibility, I'm a brown, round queer with glasses, and I have COVID short hair, so I'm wearing a black shirt and a light blue cap. I'll be reading a couple poems, and I will be a Virgo and start my timer. Tell a child about something that causes you fear or dread. With gratitude to Samia Bashir. It's okay to just be wounded sometimes, to gape, cry, rock, shiver, rumble, to ramshackle, to shake ancestors in your sleep, to be part dead, razor, lash, hang, to be the thing that flails, to be cathedral, to be gravestone, to speak cobweb. Let me tell you, to die every day is the kind of pulse that makes music, to be the kid who leans against books more than people, to be the book as it opens, closes, folds in on itself on that same paragraph, to be the underlined stanza whose body bursts, syntax, scars naked, love body. When it emblazons family curse, when you are the bad joke at the family table, when you are shuffled scrapes of forks, the weirdo told to shut up, forsaken. Let lonely make a lens so clear, you become intergalactic. Let the residue be a blanket you shed every season. Let your gaze be salve and maybe sign of the cross. Let you be blessing no one understands. Let you be words a stranger waits for. Let you be bunker you crawl into. Let you guffaw. Let you cackle. Let you be last one left. Let you be last one. Let you be last. Let you be. Let you. Let. So this next poem, content warning for mentions of trans hate and trans violence, targeted towards trans masculine people, and also mentions of unaliving. So have a snack, get some water if you need. The title is When I'm Trying Not to Jump Like My Brothers. 1, because Caden called 911, because Kaite couldn't cry anymore, because there are boys' chests that house hearts for a world that can't stand their gas. When leisure walk means to be harassed, dragged by hair, kicked in stalls, torso clash, discarded to tile, dude sneer, faggots. When I'm not faggot enough. Whole cis men strike stares on subway. Whole cis men tell me tales of their penises. Like, correction is only punctuation of 1 night, 1 minute. That's all it'll take. Next poof. I'll be a darling wife. My set of teeth, a bland picket fence. 2. The first time I wore a men's suit as drag, my mother kept crying, huh? Why did we? Why did we even come to this country? As though I was the war, as though I was the bomb dropped in her dreams the first time I cut my hair short, follicles to the floor. My mother crowed, where's my little girl? Where's my child, huh? Picture me on my knees, pleading to prove to this country that I wasn't a ghost. 3. There are no gay children in the heart of mothers like mine. See, just mistakes, killable kin. My people, we don't make headlines. Did you know, okay, what it is to get a Facebook message? I'm old, I'm so sorry. Twitter, Instagram post, TikTok, text message with the face of the dead friend, pupil, student, glare grief, but you just laughed with them, right? Weeks earlier, months earlier, how? I saw them at the protest or the fundraiser. 4. I was about 18 when my friend A flung themselves off a cliff. Brown boys don't turn into men without fighting cis men on stoops, blood varnished at house parties by cis men cousins, by cis men uncles, a teenager. Thought better to face flat rocks on California bluff, could be more solace than the frowns of his blood family. 5. A bluff. It's a double entendre for precipice, also known as calling your, sometimes considered a scam, a sham. Bluff, also known as out loud. Bluff as forthright. See also bordering a river. Coastal crest. Our gender so brazen we must be silenced, surrendered. Tell me, can you hear us? Trying not to. Shattering to the ground. Thank you. And this last poem is another minute. To be underwater and holy. This is for disabled and sick people. Spoonies, if you were. Every survivor is splendor. Every spoon is sacred. Every cough is an altar on the bend of a rib cage. Every cane is a drum calling into this earth. You're going to be told that you are not worthy of a party. You'll be told that your body is not a celebration. So why exist at all? Because breath is an exhausted ship lapping the wind. Because your muscles are the fatigue of a sunset. And when your bodies are carnal waves collapsing, remember, beloved, together we can find the shore. Together we can rock and wave, rest, float. Together we need to move together. Together we can rupture veins into storms. And together we can be the grit, as promising as the sound of shells. Our lineage tells us there will always be land and ocean in our bones. So after every shift of tide, no matter the catastrophe, please hold on if you can. Here's a promise, nah? Dare to press an ear against my chest, and on this love, we'll grow scales for every current. We'll part every sea like scripture. Thank you so much.
Hey, that was magnificent. Tembi, would you like to read for us?
Sure. I'm Tembi. I'm calling in from Woodside, New York. I have big curly hair. It is red, which is my natural color. If anybody asks me, I don't want to speak about the hair color I was born with. This is mine. My shirt is I'm wearing a gray shirt. And yeah, I think that's everything I was supposed to say. I always forget when when I have to do these things. So did I hit everything?
Your pronouns are she, her, hers.
Oh yes,
correct?
yeah, my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to read from my novel Homebodies. And I'm going to read from a point where Mickey is just recognizing, like she's just kind of falling apart. And this is going to be about her mental health at work. When a 15-minute meeting popped up on Mickey's calendar the following Thursday, she was startled but not surprised. Nina had messaged her immediately before, asking her if she could come in, as if Mickey wasn't on her way already, and Nina needed her permission to cut her loose. Mickey nearly said no, but she knew resistance was futile. This was happening, whether she allowed her to or not. Now Mickey stood just outside the door to La La Land, a conference room used specifically for letting people go. It was overly large and conspicuously private, the only room with windows that faced only the outside. Moonlight, coincidentally, was a small, suffocating phone booth designed for one. She had sensed it coming in the days leading up to the event, but still she hadn't expected it to happen so soon. Of course, there had been little signs throughout the week, the biggest being the revolving door of well-dressed Black girls that had stomped through the building, past her desk and into a side room with Nina, where both would disappear for half an hour before reemerging with a beaming Nina thanking them for their time. Mickey, perhaps naively, hoped that they were replacing Jordan, but now it was very, very clear that one of them would be replacing her. Mickey entered the room and found Nina and Kathy, the head of HR, waiting for her. "Hi, Mickey. Thanks for coming in," Kathy said, her crow's feet wrinkling as her mouth spread into a shape that resembled a smile. Mickey resisted the urge to turn around, walk to her desk, and start on the day's work, but she met the woman's eyes instead. She could tell that Kathy had been pretty once, when the doughy thickness of her skin had still been bouncy and supple, and her lips had been visible, rather than the too thin lines that currently disappeared when she opened her mouth. "Please sit," Kathy said, her tone gentle but insistent. Mickey shivered at the insincerity, realizing they were afraid she would be loud and cause a scene. She briefly considered it, Imagine that instead of sitting down like she was told, she would pick up the chair and hurl it across the room, hitting Nina in the head and watching her body crumple to the ground. She would laugh maniacally at the sight, snap photos for memories. Then she would turn to Kathy, who would undoubtedly be mortified, and slap her across the face, tell her to stop gawking and ask in a condescending tone, "Didn't anybody ever tell you it was rude to stare?" She pulled out the chair instead, gripping the back with unnecessary force and sitting down as gently as her rage could allow. Nina wouldn't look at her, staring out into middle distance, then the table, before repeating the cycle again. The room was quiet, and Mickey realized that they were waiting for Nina to speak. Nina swallowed and tucked strands of hair behind her ear, her forehead wrinkling from the effort. "Due to your inability to complete tasks in your performance, we're going to have to let you go," she said, the words tumbling out all at once in an order that seemed unnatural. Mickey felt the words in her gut, alarm marrying devastation and producing an overwhelming shame. It wouldn't occur to her until later that she'd never had a proper performance review. No one had given her the opportunity to improve, but now she was certain that she hadn't been enough. By the time Nina got up to leave the room, without so much as a glance in her direction, Mickey was on the verge of tears. Then it was just her and Kathy who began explaining how everything would work. After the meeting, she would not be allowed to go back to her desk. Instead, her things would be shipped to her home, boxed up by someone, likely Evie, who would make sure she didn't leave a single thing behind. She would get severance and would be able to file for unemployment. Kathy said this part like it was a blessing, like the last act of benevolence was taking care of their former employees. They, meaning the company, wouldn't disclose the reasons for her firing or talk shit about her outside the company's walls, provided she signed an NDA that would stop her from speaking out and writing an article, or more damningly, a book. They wished her well, with Kathy speaking for the entirety of the they, and hoped that she would shortly land on her feet. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" Kathy asked, resting her arm on the table and leaning in slightly to signal that she was all ears. The movement made her stiff shift dress crinkle, and Mickey bristled at the sound. Kathy slid a manila envelope across the table, sealed with papers for Mickey to sign. "We'll send you a copy via email, too." Then, as if by magic, Kathy produced a box of Kleenex, placing it in front of Mickey with a practiced flick of the wrist. "Yeah, actually," Mickey began. "What happens if I don't sign?" She was curious, mostly. "You wouldn't receive severance and we would part ways," Kathy explained, her mouth hanging open in a half smile. "So the NDA?" Kathy blinked. "Of course that wouldn't apply." "Good to know," Mickey said with the click of her tongue, watching carefully for Kathy's reaction. There was none. Her aging face remained frozen in place. "I was just checking because, given the circumstances, I think people need to know what happened here." "What happened?" Kathy leaned forward, suddenly interested. Mickey leaned in too. They were slightly too close. It felt conspiratorial, as if they were on the same side, almost. "I'm just confused about how I'm being fired on the grounds of performance if we've never had an evaluation of my performance prior to now," Mickey said, using her most formal voice and speaking slowly. It was the only way of keeping her voice steady, knowing if she spoke faster, her voice would get louder and then she would cry. "There were no warnings or anything leading up to this. It's clear you're trying to clean house and that this is targeted." Kathy tilted her head to the side. "I'm sorry you feel that way. We truly hoped that it would be a good fit, but unfortunately it didn't work out that way." "A good fit in what sense? A good culture fit?" Mickey asked, matching Kathy's head tilt and expression. Kathy reddened. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Mickey said with a sigh. "You might as well have just said you don't want people of color on the team." "Of course not," Kathy said, now alarmed. "Letting you go has nothing to do with that. It's about performance." "Then why did Nina say we were moving away from identity?" Mickey asked. "What does that even mean?" "Well, I'd have to ask Nina," she offered in reply. "I can't speak to the various editorial directions of the different sites, but diversity and inclusion is a global mandate for every publication we own." "So why didn't you rehire someone after Jordan? Why am I now the only Black person on my team?" Mickey asked. "And why has Nina only hired white people since she got here?" "That's something we can look into," Kathy said, scribbling a quick message on a notepad. "I think that would be a good start," Mickey said, feeling emboldened. "But I wouldn't recommend working here to any Black women or women of color. Every managing editor in the company is white, and none of them are prioritizing diversity on their teams." Mickey was talking faster now and felt the spit gathering on her tongue and settling in the corners of her mouth. She wondered, briefly, if she looked as enraged as she felt, or if the flash of nervousness in Kathy's eyes was a trick of the light. "Well, thank you for that feedback. We'll certainly take that into consideration moving forward. I know the person they hired for your position is a African American." Mickey was livid now. "How was I supposed to even keep my job or improve if they've already replaced me? How is that fair? Can you or someone just admit that you planned on firing us from the moment we were acquired?" Mickey tried to keep the desperation out of her voice, but she couldn't tell if it was working. "And recruiting in my group of friends like it wouldn't get back to me? There's only so many Black beauty writers in New York. How was I supposed to do my job well if this is what I'm up against?" Well, I'm sorry you had that experience, Kathy allowed, her mouth flipping into a frown. But it wasn't our intention to hire and fire. I wanted this to work out. As for the other claims, hiring is supposed to be confidential. You shouldn't have known about that. Kathy leaned back into the ergonomic chair, resting her elbows on the curved plastic arms. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. I could see how that could be stressful. Well, I did know about it, Mickey said, her voice sounding strange and small, and it made it really hard for me to do my job. And I'm sorry for that, Kathy said, pushing the Kleenex a little closer. Mickey realized that she started crying again, her body betraying her will to stay strong. Really? You're not sorry, Mickey replied, snatching a tissue from the flimsy opening, because nothing is going to change, and I know that. But I needed someone to at least hear my side.
Thank you so much for that reading, Tembi. I've mentioned Homebodies to many, many people since I read it in the last couple of weeks.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Thank you.
I will also do a short reading. My novel is The Skin and Its Girl, and it tells the story of a queer Palestinian American woman who's born with cobalt blue skin. And much of the novel is written in second person, addressed to her auntie, Aunt Nuha, who is in many ways the family storyteller, and the myth maker, and queer herself. And during this time that has been incredibly difficult for Arab Americans and the world, and so we watch genocide unfolding in real time, and having to sit with that, and do what we can to raise our voices from so far away. It's felt particularly difficult and volatile to speak to these issues, in a space that's so often, as I talked about, sacred, that quiet place that we as readers want to enter. But right now everything feels very noisy. I typically read from the beginning of the book, but at a time when so little makes sense, I want to read from a section where the narrator is relaying a version of an origin story, in an attempt to make sense of things, because sometimes we have to dismantle the narratives that we receive, in order to survive on ones that feel truer to us. So the first part of the novel, the narrator, Betty, she's narrating about her birth, and her mother has faced a lot of mental health issues of her own, and her mother's still in the hospital. Yet, when I imagine my mother that day of my birth, looking out a plate glass window at the city, seeing an illegible place full of strangers, or when I imagine myself as an immigrant in a land I've never seen, watching wars play out on the news as the children who call me auntie grow old enough to fight in them, I cannot help but wonder about the first branching, the primordial split. Not the Garden of Eden, you said. All of our problems began with a flood, and the first great demolition story of the Bible. Long ago, all stories told only the truth, in a literal way, with no need to jump around and gather meanings piece by piece. This was because, you said, humans had been happy animals, and we remained happy for a short time after we had shed the last of our fur, when we still moved in tribes and answered our children's pleas for snacks in grammatically correct refusals, and we all spoke a single tongue. We humans fell in love, named our children, and migrated to new places without need of a dictionary or a map. Stories served no purpose but to tell exactly what happened. Lying as a possibility occurred to no one. Then one day it began to rain. Quite a storm, we said to one another, the multitude of us in our same language. Better bring the washing in. Better bring the children too. As we huddled indoors with our washing and our children and our worries, the skies poured, glaciers melted, and all the world's headlands and peninsulas turned into isolated knuckles of land. It wasn't as bad as the primary texts insist, but somewhere a curmudgeon named Noah floated on a boat that reeked of animal shit, gazing across the floodwaters. The people who were drowning asked for help, but he pretended not to understand the words. But we don't need to bother with his story anymore. The flood is the thing. And so is the authority he worshipped and the origin of forking paths as the waters receded and revealed land anew. After the sodden earth began to dry, we all, the survivors, talked in our single language about who had died and what we'd lost and what we could have done better. And we decided that we should scoop clay and slime from the earth and make bricks and mortar of it. And we built a tower, high and higher. Look at us, working together, all to the same end. Our tower was miles wide, a stone hive of cities, tunnels, colonnades, and floating coliseums, an architecture of giddy excess. Anyway, when we humans were done, we climbed the millions of stairs above the waterline and stood on the roof, breathing the thinner air, and could see the rising sun, the white sea, and the incredible bounty of what remained. Under our feet was the earth's weight in bricks we'd fired and carried with our own hands. But the God, the thing called Lord, still paid visits. You said to pretend Lord was real, sort of a spinning ball of ectoplasm with a temperament like your least favorite brother, worshipped by the animal-loving curmudgeon in his boat. We humans were assigned to its supervision by no choice we remember making, and when the Lord saw the tower, it felt we humans had gotten out ahead of it. Sputtering and spitting, it demanded to know who had authorized the construction, and did they have the proper permits? When we humans crossed our arms and said it was a joint decision, and we surely needed no permit to enjoy our collective survival, the Lord blew our grand uppity tower to bits. Thus, Babel became the predecessor of every faraway city that would ever be translated to a plume of smoke. It also became the point at which the human story begins to fork. When we humans finally tore our gazes from the rubble and our shock began to harden into outrage, the Lord noticed that there were a million of us and only one of it, so the Lord made some hasty decisions. It assigned us to districts and put up checkpoints and required ID cards to be stamped and counterstamped by approved stampers only. And it changed the colors of our skin and implemented a randomized system of worship requirements and gave some of us all the timber and took away all the water from others. And for good measure, it twisted our words and consonants and vowels like putty, so that we peoples of the world spoke 1,000 different tongues. We tried to say what had just happened, but now no one could agree. Looking upon what it had wrought, Lord said, good luck, and that was the end of human cooperation for now. And Lord went home to rest. I'll stop there. It was a gift to hear all of your words and get those in the Zoom room, and to whoever's listening today. I'd like to turn to some questions. We probably have more than we'll get to, but thinking about who might be in the audience, other writers, passionate readers, people who just love books, librarian bookseller allies. I think we'll cover a lot of ground today. So I want to start just as a starting place for our audience to bring our topic out into the light and talk about queer mental health and queer joy. I'm curious what highs and lows have been important in your writing to highlight. And if you want to each talk about how your work engages with any kind of health, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, and how you pull that into your writing practice and your craft.
I can go first. It was really important for me for Mickey's struggles, and she deals a lot with mental health in the novel, and it was really important for me to write a character who was not struggling with her identity and was like very firm and set in that. That was really important to me because that is the reality for a lot of people. Like I think that that is almost that almost feels like the faraway mountaintop, I think, for queerness in some ways, of like feeling very settled in your identity. And like when I was coming out, I don't know that I knew what that endpoint would look like. And when I reached there, I was like, I want to write something for people to read where they can see a world where that is how it exists, that it's not a question, it's a fact. And no one's questioning it, no one's asking you or interrogating your identity. Like you're allowed to just exist and be a person and be a human being. And life happens to you the way that it happens to everybody else, but your identity is the thing that's not up for debate. And that was really important to me. And also even into like she exists at the cross section of a lot of like politicized identities. She's a fat woman, she's a queer woman, she's a Black woman, but I didn't want any of those things to be the mantle upon which her problems rested. I wanted her to be dealing with her like I want her to be just dealing with like the everyday difficulties of life, like while being informed by that, but that not being the constant conversation on the page. Like I wanted her to show up in the world much in the way that I do, and like I always exist like this, and so it's not always a topic of conversation. Like there are things that I'm invested in outside of my identity, while also being still very deeply informed by that. Um, and so yeah, and I also just want to write about like a Black girl with anxiety. I think we don't talk enough about um just the mental health struggles that Black women face and like what that looks like and how that shows up. And I just wanted her to write about a character who had the opportunity to take up space on the page in a way that was unapologetic and very vulnerable, and to do that for 300 pages, because you don't always have to have it figured out. You don't have to be strong. And I really wanted to like illuminate that. Like that was really, so in a lot of ways, the book is about mental health as much as it's about anything else.
Thank you. Yeah. And we see Mickey move through a number of different situations too that sort of pull out different angles of that identity, and how she navigates that, uh, which was one of sort of the drivers for me, and seeing how she responds to each situation. Uh, other responses?
I can talk a little bit. Yeah, I feel like for my characters in both People Collide and my first book, they're not really addressing their health in a lot of ways, and I think that they are people who seem to be swept. If I know in my first book, The Atmospherians, their characters, one of the characters is a wellness influencer. And I think she's absolutely really swept up in this idea of how to be healthy. And they're really shaped by what I would think of as like um, fallible versions of health. And I'm really curious about the way that people give over themselves to like mythologies of health and to really like cheap versions of health. And I think that comes up especially for Eli in People Collide. He's someone who seems to care a lot about his physical health, and makes brief references a lot of times to like emotional health that he hasn't actually dealt with. Other characters talk about it as well. So there's definitely something that's happening outside of Eli's um, ability to speak about his own well-being, that other characters know that things have happened to him. There's a third person omniscient narrator that comes in that is able to speak about things that happen to him that he doesn't really speak about himself. So those, I think the relationship to health is one that they don't really even know how to begin to address it. And it's always something that characters are in conflict with. And I wouldn't necessarily say that they're repressed, but they are really unaware and don't really want to even give themselves the space to do that. I think as it reflects on especially queerness, there's there's a sex scene in the middle of the book. And like before that, between the two main characters after they have swapped bodies, and Eli makes a very like brief aside about his bisexuality, which like comes and then goes really briefly in the book. And that's something too that Eli is someone who feels very like this whole book is about a sense of freedom through this new, to think of a body as a container, right? Like understanding this new physical form is a way that he's able to actually speak more about himself. And those little moments are always really interesting to me, where a character reveals what they might potentially be going through. And I don't necessarily see the novels that I've written as like immediately addressing the character's mental health, but I think it's always there, like humming in the background, like their physical, their emotional, and their mental health is always a huge part of it. And the ways that they've been taken in by insidious versions of health that are really that cause a lot of strife and conflict for the characters is always like a, I think, internal tension for a lot of the people I'm writing about.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think speaking on that tension, I think in my writing, because I'm not necessarily working with characters forward, that in both books, in my poems, my goal was always to like unpack what is missing and unpack like in poetry. When I published my first book, 2016, 2017, all the trans poets were white and they all had MFAs. They came from middle class backgrounds, at least the ones that seemed to be more in the literary. And so I was coming in a really lonely place, I think, and that was a low for me. And I had to realize now, like as a trans person living in the pandemic. When I'm talking about like queer joy, I'm also talking about both and, like I'm talking about the rage that brings me to the joy. I think that's also because I come from an organizer background and like a movement building background where I try to understand like what are the happenings systemically that may feel really bleak, right? So I think I've been really helpful in knowing that I need that rage and the privilege to rage as an American, as a light-skinned person, as a transmasculine person, and what that means. And also, I think part of the highs and lows is to have sarcasm and humor in my work. I think that really tries to buoy some of the harder moments. You know, when I wrote my first book, I was precariously houseless as a trans person. I was under governmental supplemental assistance, writing poems, you know, scribbling them down. And so I'm at such a different place in both books. And to really understand what do sick and disabled, trans, queer, Black and or Indigenous people of color, you know, do when they're really lonely? Like, how do we take care of each other? Whether we're eating together or sending voice texts or sharing food stamps or anything that the state can impose on us, I want for my poems to really consider, you know, not necessarily the framing of mental health, because I think the institution is rough, you know, it's very misleading. But I think my books want us to consider, what does collective care look like, especially from my lens, being a trans, disabled, non-Black person of color, migrant person. So, and those are the people I carry with me in my audiences. I try to prioritize those ancestors and those communities first if I can.
Seems like a good place to pick up on the question of audience. You know, how do we center, you know, queer needs for representation and a safe space in literature? For whoever wants to respond, or if you all want to respond, as you imagined your audience during the writing and the revising processes, how did that guide the development of the work? What queer aesthetics or book mentors or literary mentors, you know, or ancestors did you reach for as an inspiration, as a way of continuing that tradition?
I can go first again. I'm like, it's the Virgo Leo moon combo. It's a really a special one. But I really love this question. I dedicated my book to the women who look and love like me, and that was really intentional. I think a lot about legibility in my work and like who can see me and who needs to be seen and like what that looks like. I'm not writing. My audience is always like Black queer women first, and then everybody else is kind of like a tertiary, secondary audience. Because I do believe that the specific gives birth to the universal. Like it's a human experience at its core, but it's a very specific kind of human experience. And so when thinking through the aesthetics, it was really important for me to name drop artists that like we would all collectively listen to. Like, you know, I'm mentioning SZA and Earth Gang and Summer Walker. It's like there's a lot of just in Cleo Soul, like there's a lot of like I intersperse like music and food and apartment styles and all these things that feel very just like feel like features of contemporary Black life and like young contemporary Black life right now. When I think about who I look to, I look at people like Zora Neale Hurston, who like Janie isn't necessarily a queer character, but she's a wild character. And I really like wanted to write about wild women and women who were pushing against what was expected of them. And like even Homebodies does that in a very different way. Like Mickey's not like killing her husband and like running the streets and doing all this stuff and like having this like epic journey in a way, but she is pushing back against certain expectations, many of which are internal, but that was like really informative to me. Also, Nicole Dennis Benn, I think that was like one of the first times I had read like a Black lesbian character on the page as like an adult. I was just very floored. I was very shocked and like felt very seen by that. Alice Walker was very formative for me as well. I think that, you know, that was the first time I thought of queerness as freedom and like queerness as getting closer to the knowing of self rather than further away from. And like the way that a woman loving another woman could result in self-actualization. And that was like one of the big questions that I was thinking about when I was first writing Homebodies, which was what does it look like when women turn to each other for everything? Like, whether that's love, that's hate, that's sex, that's everything. I was just very concerned with creating an interior world populated by other women and like engaging with each, like where they fulfilled all of each other's needs. And so yeah, the Color Purple really, I think, laid the foundation for what something like that might be. So those are my things.
Should we keep up the order? Yeah. Or cool. Are we all Virgos, by the way?
Are we all Virgos?
I'm
Yeah.
Virgo rising.
Oh,
Okay. Wow. Incredible.
panel. Amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Yeah, that's what brought us together. It was the stars.
Yeah, whoever picked us is a genius.
Yeah. Channy picked us. Okay.
No, the name has to be just Virgo panel now. Like Virgo authors. Like it can't even no more queer mental health, just Virgo authors.
Yeah. It's such a fascinating to think about. Like, I think aesthetic wise for people collide, or like when I'm thinking about audience, I feel like I'm constantly writing to like two different audiences. I especially felt that in my first book, which like some people would like, cis people would read it and be like, wow, what a weird, strange romp. And then like trans people would read it and be like, oh, like this person, like this is a story about like a person who's closeted and acting out, right? Or like there are all these like coded messages in the book. But like I wasn't even sort of like trying to write. And I'm really curious about writing in a manner that is like unintentional, trying to find yourself through a book. And I think there is a sense of self-discovery. I know for me, like writing my first book, it was before I came out pretty late, and writing that was a way to sort of explore my identity safely away from other people, sort of a room that I could like play around in by myself and sort of explore some ideas. And then in the second book, I think I was exploring more and more like some things that I'd actually lived by that point. And as for like the people who were influencing me, like I mean, Imogen Binny's Nevada, I think, is a huge influence, in part because I really love the way that book writes, or the way that Binney writes about like self-deception in a way, especially as like both the dangers of self-deception and the dangers of knowing yourself really well, and how that makes you think that you know other people better than they know themselves. Eileen Miles has always been huge for me. I really love their work. And even someone like Robert Balser, who was a Swiss writer in the early 20th century. People who just like write a lot about movement and walking around, and that type of like sentence style I found really exciting. And Miles is someone who seems like in conversation with Balser, and both of them writers of like movement and an almost like sort of picaresque walking style. To me, it was always really fascinating. So those writers. I really love Jackie S's Daryl, which again is another book about self-deception and an attempt to understand oneself. And Daryl too is S is a trans woman, but Daryl's a book about a ostensibly like cis white guy who is a cuck, and how much like the opening of the book is just about how much he loves watching people hook up with his wife. And the entire book is just like a really fascinating like exploration of identity that isn't necessarily about like trans identity. And I think the way that some writers are writing, or even like Tori Peters writing in Detransition Baby, the boss character in that book, I'm spacing on her name, but like how a vision of queerness can be applied to people who might think of themselves as like predominantly cis or straight. I'm really fascinated by the writers who are able to sort of bring that lens to other more like predominant identities. And I think that's fun to sort of mess around with and look at and sort of critique from a different angle. And I really admire the writers who do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I'm really into hybrid poetics and hybrid art. I started out in theater. Actually, poetry wasn't forward, and I started reading political essays, or like what is known as like cultural nonfiction, right? So like Grace Lee Boggs, and I would read speeches by like Sylvia Rivera. And so those things really anchored me, I think, when I try to approach my nonfiction essays and when I try to approach my poetry. Poetically, I really uplift all queer and trans, mostly BIPOC people. So Samia Bashir was a very important mentor to me. T.C. Tolbert was one of the few trans poets that I read when I started. Eli Clare, who's a renowned disabled hybrid working class writer, trans writer, who writes poetry interwoven with like memoir and essay as a disabled person, was really important. And yeah, I think I had this like benevolent circle of non-binary, queer, trans, beautiful people that I just, when I go to a fellowship residency, I set up my desk. I'm like, here's this altar, here's Sylvia Rivera, here's Brandon Lacey Campos, Marsha P. Johnson, Polly Murray. And I think that really helps to ground, like, where am I going? I never want to assume that I'm the first, because I'm not. And there were others before me. So it's really critical for me to like ground in that, not just as an aesthetic. And then people who I feel who had great stakes in my work, who I was trained by, was Sharon Bridgeforth, who wrote poetry, but also does theater and hybrid interactive performance as a Black butch person from the South, right? But it was important to me for both my books to have committees of people, not just beta readers, but committees of people who weren't poetry forward and not literary forward. So I had theater artists, I had holistic workers like Alexis Pauline Gums was in my committee. There's just a range of people who didn't see writing as something merely scholastic or something even on bookshelves, but something that's like tangible. How is our writing a strategy? How can that transform the way we dream or imagine our current circumstances? And I think that was really important for me. And I also read a lot of dead moms, like poets like Araceli Gourmay or Patricia Smith, because that's just an aesthetic that I understand with my ancestors and grief and how that can be super challenging. So I think I framed myself with like political organizer theory and movement building, and then theater work and performance. And then I braced myself fully with like predominantly hybrid poets who are movers, dancers, performers, because I don't want my poems to just be something in a literary journal. I really want my audience to expand really over that, beyond that. So that's my goal, is that most of my readers are people in my overlapping communities who probably don't give a fuck about poetry, honestly, which it really helps me with my visions.
Thank you for those really thoughtful answers. I connected with them as well as someone writing for sort of a variety of audiences, readers in the diaspora of any kind, Palestinian Americans in particular, queer people. I really felt in a lot of ways that I was making up an aesthetic for this particular project as I went along, in sort of being supported by and looking to examples of writers who worked, in their various identities and time periods as well. So for instance, like Sahar Khalife's Wild Thorns in translation was really interesting to me as a piece of work that shifted very boldly across voices and points of view, to sort of encompass a place and a time in a time period in Palestinian history in the early 70s. But also sort of more contemporary writers like Lebanese American novelist Rabi El-Amadine, who uses a lot of an oral storytelling tradition in his work. And I found a lot of, I guess aesthetically, I was interested in how you carry that sort of emotional charge of a typical American psychological realist tradition through an oral tradition and folktale, and how those pieces can speak to one another, because I did want the pieces of the novel and my audiences to be able to speak, hear, and perceive one another. Maybe it's not for everybody, this sort of fragmentary writing style, but I felt like I needed that sort of decentered or kind of spread across a number of narrative styles way of writing, to tell the story that I wanted to tell, because it covers 250 years of a family history, kind of on one level. So on that idea of fragmentation and wholeness, which I think it'd be important to readers in a number of ways because, we're seeking connection, and we're seeking community. As I read each of your latest books, I was moved by the reoccurrence of fragmentation and separation. So in Tempe, like how Mickey in Homebodies is partially nourished in all her environments, but struggles with a feeling of not fully belonging. And Kay, and how in More Than Organs we get lines like the thing where you feel like a visitor in your own flesh, separated by large spaces on the page. And Isle, the very premise of spouses who wake up in each other's bodies and far apart. I would love if you would be willing to share thoughts about this longing for wholeness in your own work, if I've even read it correctly, if there is that longing there. Like, in what ways did you or your poems or your characters find it or seek it?
Yeah, I mean, there's this one line in Homebodies that talks about that says where it's like a piece of prose where it's like double consciousness had done nothing for Mickey but like create full like separation in the folds of her skin, essentially. And that was really about kind of the weight of having to constantly mediate your own presentation, performance, and image through the lens of someone else, like that image being like reflected back onto you and you having to decide what to do with it and how to exist within it. Like, it's you are like essentially fragmented from the beginning of your existence. Like, where do you get to be whole? I'm always looking at that and questioning that and thinking about that. Because it's like, do you get to be like, it's almost a question of like, who gets to be human, and understanding that for a character like Mickey, that is not as easily acquired as like maybe a different character or someone in different circumstances. um I think that pursuit of like wholeness is also a question of acceptance of self, and Mickey really struggles with that too, like allowing herself to just for this to be okay. And I mean, in that way too, the book was I was exploring and questioning ideas about Black excellence and what it means to fall short of excellent. And in some ways, it's a it's asking the question, like, is it okay to be mediocre? And like, if you are mediocre, what does that mean? And like, is that all right? And so yeah, a lot of it is about wholeness because it's about growing up. And I think that like that is, I don't know if there's a final destination or you ever stop growing up, but I think you kind of reach these different phases where you feel more whole. So yeah, lots of wholeness, lots of fragmentation, if any of that made sense.
It's an either and state of being.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the characters Eli and Elizabeth in People Collide, there's definitely this belief that they can find wholeness in each other, and something that comes up a lot, especially after the body swap, is Eli with a sense of longing for his partner, and the strange I had an interviewer once called it like gender vertigo, of like this sense of that like he would be in this moment of like desiring this other person and then realizing that he is that person, but feeling so detached from her because he is her. And that I think is, to me, I was really curious about what intimacy looks like and this like pursuing of wholeness through intimacy. And as much as these characters can come closer to each other, as much as they can learn about themselves through each other, um, they're never really, I think they too are like falling into this false belief that intimacy can make them whole, that they can find something like they can find something better than themselves through each other, but there's also still limits for who they can be. And that tension was really exciting for me. Both this pursuit of wholeness through another person and the recognition that you can never actually find it through another person. And then when Eli is like the kind of cosmic joke of it, when he actually is given unequivocal intimacy, or what appears to be unequivocal intimacy, to actually inhabit another person, he finds himself even further away from her. Like, he finds that he is not actually like close to her, he is close to just like the imitation that he is producing. And that was really exciting for me, is that he's not able to create the whole with this person who he wants to be closer with. He has to constantly recognize that it's always going to be a production or a creation as he pursues that kind of wholeness that is both like, I think, leaving or going further and further away from who he is himself, but also coming closer to it through this kind of wholeness via performance. So I think there's a lot there of just like authenticity and performance, and a constant pursuit of wholeness that is repeatedly fractured over and over again, constantly like stepping on rakes and stuff.
Yeah, and sort of reinforced by the fact that we never really get Elizabeth's point of view, and we're not sure where she is for a lot of that story. And then we get the family constellation, such as it is at the end, as sort of a movement, or imperfect movement, as they all must be in that direction. Hey.
I think I operate from the premise of Audre Lorde's quote, which is like, we do not live single issue struggles because we don't live single issue lives. And so when I operated from that, I was like, oh, I went to an audition when I'm showing my age, Deaf Poetry Jam, right? I was maybe like 18. And they're like, do you have just a gay poem? Like, do you have just an Asian poem? And I was like, those are all things. Like, I'm going to talk about all things. And even selectively, trying to seek publication for my book, there was a lot of like, we would love to see more about like the diaspora and your mother's struggle. Can you focus more on this very important and pertinent story, but that it's in isolation, right? So I think there's this place where, colonial white supremacy works in publishing, works in the literary space, works in academia, where they really want to parse you apart. And my joke is that I tell my audiences is like, I'm a working class person. You know what a twofer is, right? Like you buy one and you get another. I'm like a fiver. You get queer people, you get Filipino people, you get working class people, dog lovers, disabled people. So the cast of my net is wider. I argue that my audience is multiplied, right? And I think when I'm thinking about wholeness in that way, I'm also thinking about disability justice, where wholeness is a principle in disability justice, where it's like nothing is in a vacuum. Everything is interconnected and interdependent. So I think it's really important for my work to talk about that and how that can be very, very conflicting, like how that conflicts in my poems are, the privilege I might have having more light skin or having a college education, moving through the disabled supplementary system for getting workers' comp or disability, or how that operates differently being a trans person in those spaces and how it could be misgendered, right? And being American as a whole, being born in the United States. So I think it's really important for me to address wholeness and how that complicates my relationship to power, right? To access, and also to the ways where, to counter that, the ways where I feel lonely and isolated and alienation. And I think those middle grounds are the ways where we can, when we're able to be whole and nuanced in our work, at least I feel for poetry, is the place where people want to read. They don't always want to read a perfect poem or the ultimate hero or the defiant voice. When I start to question my Americanness in my poems, when I start to question how I'm a cane user and part-time wheelchair user in my work, like what are the privileges in that? And so I think that's something that I like to uncover when it comes to wholeness. But I was on a panel at Lambda Literary Festival, and there was a white cis gay man in fiction, and he was just like, I don't think about my audience. I just write. I just go on my own and write. And I'm sitting here like, I bring everybody with me, like whether they're in this living realm or they have passed on as ancestors or I've studied them as mentors. So my existence in wholeness means that like I'm bringing my chosen family with me. And if I'm not doing that, then the barometer of my writing might not be so great, honestly.
Yeah, I think that also brings up a good point of how the concept of wholeness often gets left out of the literary critical space as well. That there's this illusion of separation or objectivity that definitely for the worse. I was going to say for better or worse, but really for worse, is held up as part of the job to write a review or to comment critically on a work without engaging with one's own positionality with regard to that work. feel like that opens up a lot of holes for appreciation for craft decisions and whatnot to slip through. But you mentioned publications, so maybe it'll help to jump to a publication related question too. As writers, we rely on an industry infrastructure, in its various manifestations, to bring our work out into the world and make it available. And certainly there are ways to publish work at a sort of a hyper local scale, or online, to circumvent some of those systems. But we do this work and we want our work to be recognized as well crafted. We want it to reach our communities, because they are complex communities. For the writers in our audience, can you share how you maybe negotiated with the invention and unconventionality necessary to embracing these identities, with the necessities of your various genres? So we fiction writers have to go through agents who then seek publishers. More in the poetry space, there's submitting to contests and small presses and indie presses. Can you speak about those experiences a little bit?
Yeah. I feel like my situation in publishing it's like standard, but a little unconventional in some ways. Because, unconventional in that it was just like, I was already writing professionally, like as I was already a journalist. And so I think that my experience was maybe a little easier in some ways. Like, I mean, and always felt very self-conscious because I didn't have like an MFA, but because I was already in I was in the like journals, like magazine writing space. I just had like, when it was time for like homebodies to come out, I think I had a little bit of an easier time with getting press and certain things because I was already connected to people at various like entities. But I think going back to that conversation around legibility, I think what was like the biggest learning curve for me was about how, not just about like being misunderstood, but just like what people found, like people looking for the thing that they like felt most legible to them, and for them that was going to be like Mickey's job, or like the sensationalist idea of publishing, like wanting, especially I think when you are writing about anything having to do with like characters that occupy an identity outside of whiteness, like that there needing to be like a hook or like a reason for people to invest and for people to get into it. Like, and I learned very quickly that that was going to be a priority. Like wanting to, okay, so like Mickey's job, like she's a journalist, like let's talk about that more. Let's bring that to the fore. And like even, understanding as well for myself, like that in getting my book traditionally published, like you almost have to like play that game a little bit, not to the point that you sacrifice your work, but understanding that like it's a business, and so they are going to make a business decision, and like you can write your cool weird books all you want, but like that's like that's gonna, you might just have to be a cool weird writer, and you have to be fine with that. I think there is like a level of navigating and making decisions around like, well, who do you want to be in this space, and like what are you willing to I don't know if the word is compromise, but what are you willing to lean into in order to reach a goal? Like, what are your goals, and like, what does success look like to you? And so those are things that you learn pretty quickly in this space, especially as you're navigating like first publication. There's a very steep learning curve in there for sure. At least there was for me.
Likewise.
Yeah, I feel like I've been very fortunate. I've had the same editor for both my books, and he's a queer Indian man, and he's been like so great about making my books weirder and weirder, like every time. Like, and I think like really allowing my vision to grow. Like my first book, I was pretty terrified that I would have to make like to really like bring it down. And I don't even know, like I had an ex who would refer to as like the New Yorker buzz cut or something like that. Like a writer would be very weird and then they'd publish a story in the New Yorker and it would be like, where's their them? Like and I was like assuming that that's what I would have to do, but at every stage of the way he's like, you're pulling back, like you're not being yourself as a writer. And that has been like incredible that I get to do that. And I felt like very fortunate that I've been able to do that. I don't know how, like, reception wise, I think it's been a little bit difficult to like as strange as like my editor has allowed me to be, finding a audience and like recognizing that no matter um, how much freedom I have, both from my agent and from my editor, that eventually there's a space where the like machinery of publishing has to figure out where to put you. That has been a little bit more frustrating for me, and it's like I have felt like I would rather have it be this way than the other way. But like I feel like I write the book that I want to write, and then I'm like, oh no, like, but where do I put this thing? And when it comes time to try to like find maybe potentially a larger audience than I already have, I find that it can be a little bit more difficult. But I think in the long run, I'm excited that I've been able to write books that I like. And but I do agree also there is like it's not exactly a compromise, but there is a sense of like, you know, what are you going to um like I mean writing is always and I love how you've also brought up 2K, like your audience, like there's all like unless you want to like go in the woods and write like just journals, like there's going to be an audience. And to pretend that there isn't going to be an audience and to pretend that there isn't necessarily going to be some compromise at some level, like writing is there's so much isolation and so much loneliness, but eventually we find an editor, eventually like we find an agent, we look for readers, and there has to be an eventual humility in order to actually create connection, that it can't just be a singular internal monologue. There needs to be some desire to actually communicate. And I think if I think about it in those terms, then the compromises that I might be making feel less about sacrificing myself than it is about finding a way to actually communicate with other people and to say the things that I want to say, but in a manner. Yeah.
I don't know, like I just wanted to jump back in because like to your point, like you literally just hit it nail on the head. Like I think that is just such a perfect encapsulation of what it is. Like I think those compromises, when you look at them as like opportunities to communicate better and more clearly, it does really change what you feel like you're doing. I'm like, okay, like because I think to me it also goes back to like legibility. I mean, unless you can't just be legible to your one person, which is yourself. But I think like if your commitment to legibility is commitment to an audience, like to your audience, that never feels like a compromise for me. Like becoming more legible for my audience, not necessarily for the white gaze or like the the publishing gaze, um never feels like compromise. I That was not my term, but I just was like, it really brought something up for me.
As a poet, listening to the fiction writers or the long form writers, just listening. I think in my notes I put LOL, I'm a poet. This affects me differently. Like when I was at Lambda Literary and there was an agent talk and he's like, how many of you are poets? And we raise our hand. He's like, you don't need this right now. Go on a lunch break. So I think approaching poetry is really different. You know, I think there's a cling on to what is considered the literary or highbrow, a cling on to what is MFA standard. And so I think my approach in publishing, both my books are in independent presses. The later book, More Than Organs, which is really important to me. Thank you. And the one with the sticker. That's from a press where it's considered a beautiful, bountiful press, but a liftoff press to bigger things. Like it's very, Ocean Vuong, Franny Choi, Kaveh Akbar. So for poetry, if I'm speaking to poets right now in the audience, I'm old school, I'm a millennial, and I'm Midwestern. So I believe in the potluck. Like be nice, watch your mouth, be kind to people, seek support. Poets are different in that, for example, for fellowships and residencies coming up right now, we share applications. Like if I had to go to MacDowell or Yaddo, I'm looking at other people's apps. I'm on judges committees, and for my students, I'm like, this is what they're looking for. So there's this collective commitment in poetry that's very different because we don't have the financial stakes the same way as long form writers. And I say this wholeheartedly, full chest, because my partner's in contemporary YA fiction, and when they told me their book deal and when they were looking for other agents, I'm like, I'm a poet. I don't know what it is. But the thing about poets is that we springboard into other genres, right? So like Worlds of Wonder with Amy, Ocean Vuong, Eve Ewing, there's a way where poets can really flourish because of that multiplicity we have. Elizabeth Acevedo, there are so many we can point to now. And I think it's important for poets to really streamline and share their resources in a way that supports one another, that doesn't covet or gatekeep. I think when cliques form is the problem. I want my work to have longevity as a queer person, if I'm being selfish. And the only way I can do that is support and streamline other poets and artists, right? I'm in my mid-career. I'm very grateful in getting certain resources. So what do? Somebody needs to get to pay for submission fees. Somebody else wants to get into a residency, a fellowship. I know someone as an instructor, someone like, look, I know this person personally. This is what I suggest you work towards. You can choose not to, or to opt for that. I don't know what other genres do in a communal way to streamline access. I hear from my partner, when people drop agents or select agents, they share notes. I know that there are like lit hub spaces where people are in small groups, whether it's like Black queer spaces or transgender spaces, for example, or Southern writers where they talk amongst each other to talk about facts and figures and things. And I think that's what really needs to happen, is this alternative discourse that debunks this larger machine of publishing, whether it's academic or whether it's a big five, right? To really be like, this is how I did it. It may not work for you. Here's a schematic or a rubric. The industry changes, So as a poet, I've learned to have 3 or 4 other skills to keep myself afloat because we don't see large advances. What we see are cultural capital, I want to say, a social media capital. It's a lot of performing in the auspice of being public, which is very, very neurotypical and very ableist, if I may point out, right? But really be kind. It's really simple for me. Be thoughtful to people, share your resources when you can, and just know that your work is circular. Whatever you put out there, somebody's going to be at a judge's table, somebody's going to be at a panel, somebody is going to be a moderator, and they're going to hear of you. As my mom would say in Tagalog, it's like you have to act right to get right. And so we feel like that's a very rudimentary response. But for poets, it's a small community for us. We know who is who and what's what. And so just try to be as honorable as you can, whatever that looks like for you, and humble. You weren't the first person here. We won't be the last, And I think that's what's important if we want to all get our rice, get our bread, get abundance.
That is some powerful advice, Kay, and I love that model of transparency and sharing. I feel like that's one thing that our side of the publishing industry could do with more could really benefit from. I feel like the experience of debuting is a tough one because there's this sort of watershed between having, being a writer who has worked as hard as you possibly can at the extent of your skills and your resources and community, and then you finally get that sort of institutional validation that somehow shuts you off, or creates a barrier between yourself and that community that you've built up. Like I found debuting to be, thrilling and an opportunity to learn a lot of skills, but also somewhat isolating for that reason, because I feel like I've said so many times that there isn't that much difference between who you were before the book deal and who you are after, and that there still needs to be that collective sharing, because what happens good for one book, it might not happen for the next one, or it might not be right for the next one. And that sharing is really, really important. And as we're coming to the end of our time, I think maybe Tembi fell off. I don't see her in the Zoom, but hopefully she'll pop back on. I guess in terms of final words, Kay, you presented a vision that of a writing community that could be really supportive. I wonder, Isle, do you have a short future vision of something that could help our space and feel supportive and healthy for the queer and trans and BIPOC and Indigenous people in our community?
Yeah, I feel like Kay said just about everything. I mean, I do think like I wrote a piece last year about like literary friendships for Esquire and just about like how there's been a move away from competition. And I think like that's something that like that piece was really incredible to write and like to talk to so many writers. I talked to a couple writers who were like on the phone with me at the same time because they were hanging out, and to just talk to all the people who were creating um, community with each other. And like over and over again, what I heard from everyone was that like we only have ourselves. Like publishing is going to do what is good for publishing, and the only way that writers can actually succeed and grow and support each other is by supporting each other. And eventually these big publishing houses are just businesses, and as soon as we're no longer um, like popular. Morgan Parker said something about this years ago in an interview that I think about all the time, where she's like, yeah, like I'm trending right now, but I might not be tomorrow. So I need to make sure that the people whose work I admire and respect, I'm showing up for, so that we can continue to show up for each other. And I keep that close to my mind all the time. And I'm always trying to do a lot of things that like Kay said as well too, always trying to show up for people, always sharing my resources, right? Maybe all of my like freelance editors hate me because I give out their emails so quickly to anyone who wants to ask. But I think like we just have to, I'm fortunate that other people have shown up for me in that way. And so I always want to keep pushing it forward to other writers. Because it's hard. It's like really hard, especially if you're not like a Ivy League kid or something. Yeah. But
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I honestly think that this idea of competition instead of collaboration is so toxic in our communities. And I think that everything that we can do, Tenvi, I'm so glad you made it back. Everything that we can do to keep our work at human scale, because I really feel like that's where the kite starts getting away from us whenever, you have a book that hits the media and there is buzz around it and it starts to seem like something larger than life, or the social media reach, whatever. Like it all feels beyond human scale. And I think there's enough in our lives that make us that try to make us feel small, but that collaborative spirit, I think, helps keep, I don't know, it helps keep this feel human and real and supportive, and to give not just the work longevity but our relationships. That idea of literary friendships is so important. Tembi, I had just posed a kind of a last question. If there's any one thing that you would like to see more of in our community that supports mental health and joy, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the community friendship of it all that everyone's been speaking about, I think that that's super important. Although recently I've been going around telling people, I'm like, bring back rivalries, bring back competition. I want to see some more drama. I miss it. You know what I mean? I love a storyline. Bring back letter writing, public stuff. I'm like, I want to see, or like just publishing the group chat text messages. I want to see, I like a storyline and I like a real life storyline. Like I like the meta-ness of it all. I'm like, I don't know. I love the tea, but like not in a mean catty way, in like a iron sharpens iron way. I think it's good to be. I think there's ways to be critical in ways that are like helpful and supportive of the work and not like attacking the work. And I want to see that evolution and more just like deep thought and like engaging deeply with work. And especially when it comes to writers who are in marginalized identities or politicized identities, I would love to see their work engage with critically on the craft level, or like what are the, or like creating lineage between work as an act of criticism, like using criticism to create lineage. I think that that's really helpful. Like I love when I'm reading something and that points me to something else. And I think that good literary criticism has the ability to do that, to say like, oh yeah, you're reading this and this is actually borrowing ideas from this thing, and that thing, and it's in conversation with this thing and this thing and that thing. And like, here's where it was successful and here's why that worked. And like, here's why, you're feeling the way that you do about that. I love when literary criticism can expand your understanding of the work versus like, I liked it or I don't like it. I always think that that's like the least important question. Who cares if you liked it or not? Like, it's not really about personal taste. It's like, how can we really create art around art? And I think like doing that for books that are like, or like anything written by or worked on by people with marginalized identities is helpful. Like it helps to extend the life of a work. That is what makes it immortal, is like for people to elevate it and take it away from just the author and maybe the immediate reader, and to like elevate it into a bigger conversation, make it thematic, make it grand, make it epic. So I want to see more of that happening, and I'm trying to do my best to figure out how to participate in that conversation. So yeah.
Thank you, Tempe. That is a beautiful vision, and I'm really just so excited to be in correspondence with y'all in real time, and to talk about community and the critical spaces that are truly supportive. I thank you for contributing yourselves and your writing and your imaginations and your thoughts to this conversation. And just want to thank Writers and Books again for this opportunity to come together. And I think that concludes our panel. Thank you again so much. I hope everybody listening goes out and buys everybody's book.
Yeah, I just want to quickly echo that. Thank you. And first, I want to chime in a little late and say that I am a Virgo moon, a Sagittarius, but a Virgo moon. Thank you,
It's a
Tembi.
Virgo panel.
Thank you, Tembi, Kay, Isle, Sarah. Thank you for being here today and for sharing so much of your work and yourselves with us today. It's been such a gift being in this space with you all and sharing it with you. Yeah, as a reminder, the books of our panelists and our moderator will be available through Ampersand Books, and I encourage you to support them. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.